This series of lecture segments will be a recap of the highlights of Unit 4, which covered emotion, social psychology, and personality. Let's start by defining the term emotion. An emotion is an immediate but brief response to a specific event, whether an environmental event, such as getting a long-awaited package, or a mental event, such as remembering a particularly painful breakup. Emotions involve conscious feelings, such as the happiness that the package finally arrived, physiological responses, such as an increase in heart rate, and changes in behavior, such as a smile. Many psychologists also think that cognitive processes play a central role in emotion. It's important to differentiate between emotions and moods. Whereas emotions are immediate and brief, moods change slowly and last for a long time. And whereas emotions are always responses to a specific event, moods often arise for no obvious reason. Sometimes you can identify the cause of a mood, but not always. Finally, emotions involve conscious feelings, physiological responses, and changes in behavior, whereas moods are a more general state. There are three classic theories of emotion, and they all differ from our common sense ideas of how emotions arise. Remember Natalie's story about how she almost hit a bicyclist while she was driving her car? The common sense idea of emotion is that an event, such as nearly hitting a cyclist, leads to a conscious feeling of being scared, which then leads to the physiological and behavioral aspects of the emotion, such as an increased heart rate and an outburst of words that I can't repeat here. Over decades of research, though, it's become very clear that this common sense idea isn't right. According to the James Lange theory, the physiological responses of an emotion actually come before and cause the conscious feelings. For example, if you're not used to caffeine and you drink a cup of coffee, the coffee might increase your heart rate and make you sweat, and from this you might start feeling nervous. In other words, the conscious feeling of nervousness arises from your interpretation of your physiological response, rather than the other way around. William James expressed the idea beautifully by writing that we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble. Although the James Lange theory has some support, it can't fully explain emotional experiences. For example, anger and excitement lead to very similar physiological responses, but very different conscious feelings. This shortcoming of the James Lange theory led to the Cannon-Bard theory, which says that the conscious feelings of emotion occur in parallel with the physiological responses. These two components are simply independent aspects of emotion. A newer theory called the two-factor theory was proposed many years later by Schachter and Singer. Like the James Lange theory, the two-factor theory argues that physiological responses lead to our conscious emotional feelings. However, Schachter and Singer added a second factor, cognitive appraisal, to explain why we can have two separate emotions, like anger and excitement, with the same physiological responses. According to the two-factor theory, we use our cognitive appraisal of the situation to determine what emotional response is appropriate for a given pattern of physiological arousal. If your heart rate increases when your favorite football team drives down the field and scores a touchdown, you'll interpret this as excitement. If your team loses because of a bad call by the referee, you'll interpret the same physiological response as anger. The two-factor theory is also related to a common way that psychologists describe emotions, the circumplex model. This model says that emotions vary along two primary dimensions called arousal and valence. Sometimes you have low arousal. You're feeling cool, calm, and collected. Other times you have high arousal. Your heart is pounding and your palms are sweating. Valence is whether your emotion is positive or negative. For example, sadness is a negative emotion and happiness is a positive emotion. So we can describe a given emotional state in terms of how aroused you are and whether you're experiencing that state as positive or negative. The two-factor theory would say that the arousal part comes from your body and the valence part comes from your cognitive appraisal of the situation.